Did our Rebbe write the Likutei Dibburim? Any history behind it? Did the Rayatsk ask him to write it? The Likutei Dibburim are the talks of the previous Rebbe, period. The thing that you have to understand about Likutei Dibburim, the first thing you have to understand about Likutei Dibburim, is that the previous Rebbe was the exact opposite of our Rebbe, as I heard it from my Mashpiyim. Our Rebbe speaks incredibly elaborately. When he talks out an idea, he develops it in very, very great detail. But when he writes, he's as concise and as crisp as the Alter Rebbe. He measures every letter. The previous Rebbe was the other way around. He wrote incredibly elaborately and he spoke very concisely. So, but the previous Rebbe, oftentimes he'd have a farbrengen and he'd speak siches, and they'd be short little siches, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes. Even at the time that he didn't have difficulty with his speech, in the 20s, he spoke relatively short. And I've heard this from people who worked on the siches. Sometimes they deliver him the hanacha, that means the transcript of what he said, which is 2 or 3 pages. He'd take a pen and just cross the whole thing out, turn over the sheet and begin to write what he meant to say, and it could be 20 pages. So a lot of the siches of the Frierdiker Rebbe that are rather long are based on what he said, but it's not necessarily the way he said it. Oftentimes it's the way he wrote it after he said it, which was a practice by the previous Rebbe, which was quite common. In the newer volumes of Siches, what they try to do is bring you both versions. They bring you what he said as he wrote it, and they bring you what he wrote as he corrected it. Although what he said he X'd out as being a version of his intent that was not adequately representative of his thoughts, but there is something about Lashon Harav, about the language of the Rebbe, the way the Rebbe said things, what we would call a hanacha. That oftentimes we have siches that the Rebbe edited and still we find value in the bilti mug, in the unedited version. So in the newer volumes of siches, they print side by side, and they'll write in the footnotes, this is what the Rebbe said, and it was unedited, and he crossed it out, and this is what he wrote. So the Likutei Dibburim are the siches of the Frierdiker Rebbe, that's number one. And number two, very often, especially the longer siches, he never spoke. He wrote them to begin with. Number two, and this is where your question comes in. Our Rebbe was absolutely infatuated with his Rebbe, with the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe's Lugazanzain was so connected to the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he felt so deeply that the Frierdiker Rebbe has so much to give in terms of Chassidus, and as he writes in one of his letters to his father-in-law, to the previous Rebbe, especially Vasarum Chassidus is what is around Chassidus. That means the stories and the history and the philosophy that explains how the Maimorim, how the ideas, the scholarship adds up to the way of life, to the Avodas Hashem lifestyle that is Chassidus. And the Rebbe was completely consumed with a desire that what the previous Rebbe has to say should get published. So if you look at the Siches and at the letters, and there's a volume of letters that was printed about 15 years ago, let's say around 2010, Tafshan Ayin, what's called Chelik Tezvav in the previous Rebbe Siches. The entire volume, start to finish, is correspondence between the previous Rebbe and the Rebbetzin Chaim Mushka. About 300 letters that the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin brought with them from Europe that never were meant to be published. Americans published them because they needed to publish them. Some of them are so poignant and so personal that I think maybe they pushed a little bit too far on the envelope. But they reveal many things about the closeness of the previous Rebbe to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe to the previous Rebbe during the European years when the Rebbe was first stationed in Berlin and then later in Paris. The Rebbe was deeply involved in all of the activities of the Frierdiker Rebbe. He was his banker. And when the Frierdiker Rebbe lived in France, when the previous Rebbe lived in Poland, the Rebbe managed his money for him. But what becomes incredibly clear is that his biggest interest, our Rebbe's, was in the Siches and in the letters, in getting the previous Rebbe to write down, to communicate, besides for the Maimorim, which all the Rabbeim did, the letters and the Siches that reveal, again using the Rebbe's cliche words, Vasarum Chassidus is what's around Chassidus, the stories, and how the stories are not just historic, but the stories are also instructive into the ways of Chassidus and the evolution of Chassidus and the intent of Chassidus, going back to the Baal Shem Tov. And in this area, our Rebbe was absolutely infatuated. He lived first in Berlin and then in Paris, and the previous Rebbe secretaries had specific instructions that every Sicha and every Maimed, obviously, but also every letter that the previous Rebbe may have written to a private person. There was a Michtav Teichni, there was a letter that had a substance that wasn't just practical but had to do with Chassidus, that a copy be dispatched to Berlin and Paris. The Rebbe had in his collection about 2,000 letters from the European years, which were the basis for the first volume of Igros Kodesh of the previous Rebbe that were published. I'm sure they found other sources of the Frierdiker Rebbe's letters to Machberes, and a lot of them were lost. But the previous Rebbe made it his business that the Rebbe should get a copy of every single one of the letters that he wrote to whomever that were Teichen Yizdika letters. And the Rebbe wrote an index of them, and if you look in the previous Rebbe's Igros Kodesh, you could see in the beginning of each letter, in the footnote, the title that our Rebbe gave each one of the letters to the previous Rebbe that was sent to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe was obsessed about having the previous Rebbe's material published, and as soon as possible. And he had a variety of forums. One of them was the Likutei Dibburim. Likutei Dibburim was a collection of siches that came out in small formatted pamphlets, and many of them were in Yiddish, where the ideas of the Frierdiker Rebbe that either he said or he wrote in the siches form were prepared for print. They'd be typed, they'd be edited, then they'd be annotated, at least to some extent. There'd be footnotes added by our Rebbe and published, because the Rebbe felt that it's incredibly important to get this information out. And the Rebbe squeezed the Frierdiker Rebbe for all he was worth. I hate to use this expression, but he milked him like you milk a cow. He asked the Frierdiker, as soon as he got one piece of stuff from the Rebbe, he asked for the next, and he was constantly asking for more and asking for more and asking for more. And the previous Rebbe was incredibly generous with the Rebbe, answering all of his questions, providing an enormous wealth of material. But again, besides for the Maimorim, also the siches and the letters, Vasarum Chasidis, which are the basis of the Chabad history that we have, which is based very heavily, primarily actually, on the previous Rebbe's talks, siches and letters. And the Rebbe began to publish them, first in the Likutei Dibburim, and of course, as you know, part of the reason he published them in Yiddish is because he wanted people who don't know how to read Hebrew to be able to read them as well. And at that time, that girls were not going to school necessarily. There was an intent that girls would read the siches, girls and women would read the siches, and it would provide them with a connection to Chassidus and with the Rebbe. That's number one. Number two, the Hatamim, the magazine that came out in Europe for a few years in Poland, and only 8 installments came out. Each one of the Hatamis was literally a small book, was over 100 pages, and it has a Shar Torah, Nigle, who was edited by Rabbi Eber, a Shar Chassidus, which was edited by the Chacha Fagin, and the Oirich Klolu was the Shmuel Zalmanov, and the Menal was Zalman Gerari. But there's a letter from the previous Rebbe to the Rebbe Tzachaya Mushka, where he writes to her that a new magazine is coming out called Hatamim, and on the cover it says the names of other people. Aber der ganze Werk is in ganz naher Manns. The entire work is your husband's, meaning the Rebbe. And the Rebbe was behind it. Now the Nigla was the Nigla and the Chassidus was the Chassidus, but the interesting part was the letters. The Hatamim was a forum for publishing very, very important information, including, beginning with the Geniza HaChesonis, which I don't have time to explain at the moment, but it was a miracle that they published it then, because the Geniza has disappeared, and as far as I know, I saw a note where the Rebbe asked the Rabbi Chitrik and the Nissim Mendel, Aleichem Hashalom, when they went to get to Warsaw in 1974 to look at the Bichlach that were there, the Rebbe asked them if the Geniza HaChesonis was there, and as far as I know, they couldn't find it. Maybe it's in Russia. But they printed enormous quantity of letters from the Geniza, which is letters of the Baal Shem Tov and Baal Shem Tov's teachers that are very precious, that give a basis for our version of the history of Chassidus Bechlal and the history of Chassidus Chabad in particular. And in addition, of course, they printed enormous volume of letters of the Frierdiker Rebbe himself that talk to and around Chassidus, including many, many stories that are very important and meaningful for us. So did the Rebbe write the Likutei Dibburim? He didn't. But if not for the Rebbe, there wouldn't have been a Likutei Dibburim. I'm not going to show you, because he was obsessive over it. In fact, there is one letter from the previous Rebbe to the Rebbe where he writes, "You're about the only person who really cares. The only one who was really interested in all of this." But the Rebbe didn't. The Rebbe persevered, and the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, was very generous, and of course we're all grateful for it. There's another letter which I find unbelievably telling, where the previous Rebbe edited a siach of his, and the Rebbe published it, and almost immediately the previous Rebbe regretted it. And he writes to the Rebbe in this volume 15, that the letter, this sicha that we printed, has no bechein, has no message that's practical. It's nice ideas, but there's no practical takeaway. And the previous Rebbe said, an idea in Chassidus that doesn't have a takeaway is not allowed to be published. And I'm thinking about our Rebbe, who obsessed with the idea of ha'maisa hu ikir, everything, action is the main thing, and the Rebbe would not allow anything, even in the most scholarly areas of Torah, not to end with a rob and a gel ha'maisa b'peil, a practical lesson in life, in Torah, in life. And yet, when he was publishing the previous Rebbe Siches, he had no issue with just printing the Sicha and giving people access to the information and the ideas, even if the lesson was something they'd have to figure out by themselves. And of course, we know that when our Rebbe arrived in New York, on the night that he Fabreng the first time, he spoke about the idea that the boys have to know the Bibburim and the Likutei Dibburim. The previous Rebbe Siches, at that time there were not that many. They should know them all. And he said, they say that the American boys are proficient in the Likutei Dibburim, and he actually tested them. And I think Rabbi Shalom Ber Gordon who got the best marks. He knew the Likutei Dibburim very, very well. Since that time, they've published a whole series of volumes of the previous Rebbe Siches, and more recently they've retyped and reissued the Likutei Dibburim as it was, although there is a redundancy here because everything in Likutei Dibburim is also in the Siches, and not everything in the Siches is also in the Likutei Dibburim. And many wise and Hasidic people feel that it's good to have both forms, even though if you have the whole set of the Siches, you automatically have the Likutei Dibburim.